Welcome everyone to our Ag Policy and Your Farm webinar series. I'll start off with a bit of an introduction of myself. My name is Roger Chevreau. I am the chair of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, often referred to as the CCGA. I'm also the chair of Alberta Canola and the director for Region 11. I am a fourth generation farmer and grow wheat, barley, and canola on 5,000 acres in Killam, Alberta with my father and my youngest son. I will be your MC today. We are happy that you're able to join us today for the second of the 3 agricultural policy webinars brought to you in partnership with our 3 prairie canola commissions, Alberta Canola, SaskCanola, and Manitoba Canola Growers Association. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be shared on our CCGA's website after the event. For questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions throughout the presentation. We will get to them at the end of the presentations today. Let's get started. Our common goal among the prairie canola growers groups is to provide solutions to government and industry on policy issues that farmers face, and we advocate on farmers' behalf to government at the municipal, provincial, and national levels. By working collaboratively, we partners in the canola industry and other agricultural associations, we're able to have a stronger voice to impact change for farmers. The canola industry has 2 influential voices at the national level. The Canadian Canola Growers Association, us, focuses on policy issues impacting farmers, and the Canola Council of Canada, which focuses on the full canola industry and the value chain. A little bit more specifically about the CCGA. CCGA undertakes policy development on issues affecting canola farmers. CCGA's policy team works to affect change on behalf of Canada's canola growers through our research on and development of policy alternatives. We represent Canada's 43,000 Canadian canola farmers on a national and international issues and advocate for growers' interests through direct representations to parliamentarians, legislators, and government officials. CCGA's board of directors is comprised of 10 farmers that each provincial canola association appoints. The representation breakdown is 3 farmers from Alberta, 3 from Saskatchewan, 2 farmers from Manitoba, and 1 farmer from each of BC and Ontario. And you can see on the screen right now, those are the actual pictures of our directors. Today we're here to explore biofuels in Canada and how there's a generational shift on the horizon. As Canada and more markets worldwide look to increase the use of renewable fuels, the Canadian canola industry has a big opportunity to meet this growing demand as a low carbon feedstock. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Steve Pratte, Senior Manager of Transportation and Biofuel Policy. Steve serves on several multi-commodity industry and government initiatives, has chaired working group technical committees, and authored a variety of reports and papers focused on Canadian grain transportation policy and supply chain issues. He's a past board member of the Canadian Institute of Traffic and Transportation and currently serves as the 50th president of the Canadian Transportation Research Forum. Steve has worked in transportation policy and systems planning for 15 years in both the public and private sectors in Manitoba and Ottawa. He holds a Bachelor of Arts, Diploma in Civil Engineering Technology, Master of Arts in Geography, and has completed a professional program in supply chain and logistics management. At this point, I'll turn it over to Steve to get things rolling. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone who joined us. Really appreciate you coming today. And really the goal here in our next 40 minutes or so together is I'd like to be able to give you, and hopefully you can take away from this, maybe not a 30,000 foot level view, but maybe more of like a 15,000 foot level view of kind of what's going on here. I'm sure as a farmer or you're a seat in industry or an analyst or perhaps a government official, I mean, you probably have been watching what's been going on in the renewable fuel space in general and the canola crushing investments, and then also what's going on with just the general state of canola in the last couple of years. And really in the time we have together, I'd like to try to leave you with a sense of where we're at as we're early into 2023 on the biofuels file in general, and then also kind of hopefully leave you with appreciation of why this presentation refers to this generational shift, because we've come a long way, and I would submit to you that we're on the kind of at this tipping point of a lot of things and a lot of hard work coming to fruition for the canola farmers, the industry, and also for just general Canadian ag and our Canadian economy. So with that, let's just get right into it. And I guess just as we start out on this conversation today, just want to just deal with some kind of nomenclature, just so we're all on the same page. And really, biofuels is a big catch-all for renewable fuels of a variety of types and processes. And I just want to kind of just remind you that what we're talking about here today in the canola world is really about diesel-based biofuels. And when we talk about biofuels, I mean, that's really a catch-all terminology. And as you can see there on the slide, there's three things, three processes, three terms that I'll use: biodiesel, renewable diesel, and co-processing. And just so we have a baseline of understanding here. Biodiesel, renewable diesel, and co-processing are three. Certainly, biodiesel and renewable diesel are two different chemical processes, two different manufacturing processes with two different outputs. So canola can be used as a feedstock in all three of those. And when we talk about biodiesel, we're talking about maybe what you have as a recollection from years gone by, where you literally take the feedstock like a canola oil, you take your petroleum diesel, and you literally mix the two, with a catalyst and some chemical reactions, and you have a property there at the end, the biodiesel, which does, molecularly, it does vary by the feedstock that went into it. So it does have different properties if it's made out of canola, if it's made out of used cooking oil, if it's made out of rendered fats and lipids and grease. They're all going to have different profiles chemically, and then also as far as the carbon intensity profile. Whereas renewable diesel, what we're talking about there, which would be mostly the focus of this presentation, is where you take a feedstock, canola, you actually hydrotreat and you crack the molecules. And as it's being blended with petroleum diesel, what comes out is, for all intents and purposes, chemically indistinguishable from the feedstock that went in. So it's basically that's why they refer to it as a drop-in fuel. It's literally molecularly almost 100% replacement for petroleum diesel. So you don't have some of the legacy issues that used to occur with biodiesel around the properties of the actual fuel. Those aren't with renewable diesel. That's no longer the case. And renewable diesel, for what we're going to talk about here today, is usually a standalone plant or a standalone process within a refinery. Whereas co-processing is slightly different, where you're taking a renewable feedstock like a canola and you're actually running it through and co-processing it with your crude oil to come out with your slate of products in the refinery. So renewable diesel and the co-processing are closely aligned. But I just want to make sure we all have that kind of baseline understanding of just that nomenclature. And if we're in the United States, they use some different terminology for these, some of these same processes and products. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out here just before we jump into things. So moving along, really to start off, we as a CCGA, as a canola industry, we look at canola biofuels, and really, you can see that tagline there, that growing low carbon solutions. And the Canadian canola industry has not just got into this lately. It's been close to 3 decades of proactivity, if you will, or monitoring and working on this issue. And really, you might ask yourself, why biofuels? Why has the canola industry been supportive of this and supportive of good and prudent policies across Canada over the years? And you'll see it there in those 4 bullets. Really, it's always been seen as a new source of sustainable domestic or continental demand for farmers' canola for your product. And everyone's very familiar with the export profile of Canadian canola and the large amounts of it that do end up going around the world. And the idea of engendering this and developing a domestic, if not continental, sliver and not wedge of domestic demand that can help support more stable markets and pricing for farm commodities, that is one of the major reasons. Secondary to that is market diversification opportunities. And really that, as we'll unpack a little further, the market for biofuels leads to, and as we're seeing come to fruition, investment in domestic processing and the canola processing, the canola crush plants, the existing ones we have, and then also this new wave of investments that are in play right now. Thirdly, and this is where it gets to the policy side of things, it's a way that Canadian farmers, Canadian canola and the industry can directly contribute to the environmental policy goals of governments. And when I say governments, I mean both provincial and federally here in Canada. And really, as over the last decade or so or longer, as governments have really turned their environmental lens to this issue and this idea of decarbonizing transportation fuels, here's a way that we as canola and you as farmers, we can play a proactive role and a positive role in helping governments meet some of their targets and their aspirations, while again capturing some value from that market opportunity. And all that leads to the fourth bullet about investment in rural communities, and again that expansion of value-added activities, which we have seen since about 2021 announced, and we'll address that on a slide a little later. And so really my main message here and takeaway from this slide is that why has CCGA and the canola value chain been involved in biofuels for, let's call it, almost 30 years? It's really about what's in that text box. We feel, and we're of the opinion, that the canola-based biofuels, it really benefits the Canadian economy as a whole and the value chain, including all the way back to the farm gate. So with that as the kind of the meta context setting, let's get into it a little bit further. So when you think about biofuels are really driven by policy. And again, those policies can come from a variety of levels of jurisdiction. But when we sit here strategically as a grower group, our top line goal here, our strategic objective, is to establish a regulatory environment that promotes canola biofuel, both production and its consumption. And so we have a canola biofuels working group is what we call it. And it's ourselves and the Canola Council and the Canola Oilseed Processors Association. And we're supported by some strategic and technical experts from the country to help us really keep our eyes on and then tactically go out and provide, again, rational, well thought out policies when jurisdictions are looking at, we're working on policies in this space. And really the long-term goal of that has been to establish a biofuel industry in Canada that specifically uses canola as a feedstock. And more recently, as we'll kind of touch on in a moment, the federal government is developing this new fuel life cycle analysis model. And really, we've been there to try to ensure and keep monitor it and ensure that at a technical level, whatever decisions are being made by the regulators, the Canadian regulators, Environment and Climate Change Canada as the department, whatever they do within this model does not disadvantage canola-based biofuels. And obviously, as we're doing even here today, I'm speaking with you on a kind of farm-focused webinar, seek opportunities to publicly promote canola-based biofuels. And I'll just go back to the life cycle analysis model for a moment and its importance. The life cycle analysis models in general are really, at the end of the day, the regulatory gatekeeper of biofuel policies, be it in jurisdictions at the provincial level and then at the federal level, and that's mirrored in the United States as well. When the goal is carbon intensity reduction and quantifying that is where we need to ensure, and this is where currently canola has a very positive greenhouse gas emission reduction profile and a carbon intensity reduction profile when used in biodiesel, renewable diesel, co-processing, et cetera. So really at that kind of nuts and bolts level, that those models, these technical kind of scientific models that are operated by jurisdictions or used in their regulations, those are really the regulatory gatekeeper. Then that's really what kind of adjudicates the various fuels made from the various feedstocks. And we do have some, I'll call it natural advantages there that we need to maintain and protect. And that will be an ongoing issue as we'll talk about. So again, just a last slide on the overarching opportunity and why we're here today to talk about this is really, it's no longer just a a new trend. This is almost an entrenched thing now that North America and even around the world, jurisdictions are introducing or strengthening renewable fuel policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in Canada, about a quarter of our total emissions come from the transportation sector, which has traditionally been somewhat, there's been some difficulty in, transitioning, if you will, the profile of transportation fuels and reducing its GHG emissions profile. But this is an area that we certainly, as we'll talk about here, have an opportunity to contribute to that. And again, just as I kind of alluded to on the GHG reduction calculations, this isn't us talking, this is, third party, this is the governments, the scientists, and everything that goes in to build these models. Canola-based biofuels are proven and quantifiable means to lower carbon intensity and the life cycle of fuels. And again, that is recognized around the world, be it the EU, the US, and in Canada. And again, just kind of putting a finer point on this, there's lots of decarbonization, initiatives out there that we read about in the paper, or perhaps you kind of keep your eyes on. But when it comes to the transportation sector, let's come out and say it, there's really no other realistic, viable, or low carbon energy alternative for heavy duty diesel vehicles, tractors, industrial machinery, transport trucks, now, and some might say even into the foreseeable future. If you really want to, as a government, to tackle this, you need to look at the fuel, and the diesel fuel particularly, and that's where I think we as canola have an opportunity to play a beneficial role and contribute to those aspirations of whatever government might be in power in a particular jurisdiction. So this is where we are today in Canada, and hopefully this is kind of a consumable slide, but we basically have two layers of policy landscapes in Canada, and these are really the demand drivers for biofuels currently in Canada. So we have, at the federal level, we currently have a 2%, and this has been around since 2011, 2012, a 2% blend rate in Canada. So it's volumetric, so all diesel, as a country, all the diesel that's placed into the country for use has to have an average of 2% renewable content. And that's the current existing lay of the land. Federally, and we'll unpack this in a couple of slides, you may have heard about, or hopefully you're not, maybe you're here today for the first time hearing about the clean fuel regulation, but that is going to replace what we've had as a renewable fuel standard in Canada, and we'll unpack that in some detail. But that's really more of a less prescriptive, there's no volume attached to that. It's all about carbon intensity reduction on a scale, and you'll see it there. It's noted as by 2030 fuel placed in Canada and to be used in the diesel pool, we'll have to have 15% carbon intensity reduction from a baseline. So that's at the federal level. Below that, provinces can set and have set over the years their own renewable fuel standards. Majority of them you'll see in red are volumetric. So in British Columbia, 4% of diesel used in that or placed into that jurisdiction over the course of the year has to have renewable content. 2 in Alberta, 2 in Saskatchewan, it's up to 5 now in Manitoba as of January 1st this year, 4 in Ontario, and 3 in Quebec. You'll note in Quebec, I've got 10% for 2030. Their latest regulatory update by 2030, 10%, you'll have to have 10% volumetric renewable content in diesel sold in that jurisdiction by that time. You'll notice a green 30% noted in British Columbia. So British Columbia is unique in their provincial regulation as far as Canadian jurisdictions go. They've got the volumetric mandate of 4%, but they also have a carbon intensity reduction schedule. So out to 2030, which is only 7 years away, according to this regulatory schedule, not only we have to place a volumetric amount of biofuels into that jurisdiction, the average carbon intensity of that fuel placed into British Columbia has to show a 30% reduction by 2030, according to a baseline. So all I have to say is over time, per the regulation, that fuel needs to become cleaner over time. So that is somewhat similar to what we're going to talk about in the new federal mandate, but the British Columbia one and that regulation, that regulatory environment can be seen to be the most progressive, if you will, or advanced in Canada, very similar to what they have in California as far as that real aggressive carbon intensity reduction as a mechanism to drive biofuel use in the province. So there's a lot of time and energy and ink been expended on the clean fuel regulation over the last few years. So when the current government came into power in 2015, in 2016, they announced they're going to be taking on the development of this new clean fuel regulation. And really at the time, the way the policy was being constructed, it had never been done anywhere in the world. It was quite all-encompassing, and really, I just want you to take away the fact that it's a complicated and wide-ranging policy approach to carbon intensity reduction in transportation fuels. And you'll see the goal there that the government put out. I mean, the average person, this doesn't mean a whole lot, but that is kind of what the overarching goal is that 15% emission reduction by 2030 over that 26 baseline in the fuels placed into the Canadian marketplace. And again, to the second bullet, it has been 5-6 years in development. It's going to be housed within Environment and Climate Change Canada as a department, and they become the regulator of this. And as I kind of alluded to with the life cycle analysis model on the second slide, that LCA model is the regulatory gatekeeper of the carbon intensities. Therefore, the kind of really translate into dollars and cents for the obligated parties, and they're satisfying this regulation. And I guess here, this is an interesting piece that we need to kind of just think about for a second. The obligated parties under the clean fuel regulation are the producers and importers of fuel into Canada. That's it. So they have that obligation to, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, but there's a variety of ways that they can meet their compliance obligations to this regulation, biofuels being one, but they are the parties that need to, that are the object and are implicated by this regulation. So that is the Imperial Oils of the world, the federated co-ops of the world, et cetera. And really, as opposed to what we've talked about, and you might be familiar with as that kind of volume-based approach to renewable fuel standards, the clean fuel regulation, it is predicated on flexibility of compliance for these obligated parties. And that was a real key policy design driver. So not volume-based, but flexibility and compliance of that overarching goal of carbon intensity reductions. So this is less of a, if you think about it, it's less of a fuel regulation, like it's not a renewable fuel standard. It is more of a carbon intensity reduction in fuel regulation. Therefore, it's completely different in its policy design and structure than renewable fuel standards in general. So hopefully you can understand that nuance. That's not lost here, but it's less about how the carbon intensity is being reduced. It's just about that it is being reduced, and that flexibility and that non-prescriptiveness for the obligated parties. Under a mandate, thou shalt put 2% in. Under the clean fuel regulation, government doesn't care how an obligated party does it. There are a few pathways they can, but it's just the fact that you do it. So we'll unpack that a little bit here as well. So the clean fuel regulation is a done deal. It was formally published in the Canada Gazette 2, which is, so it's out there as of last July, and it comes into effect this July. And as of July 1, 2023, those obligated parties, they'll need to place this lower carbon intensity fuels into our marketplace. And again, there's a schedule that they know in advance how much every year they have to reduce that carbon intensity in the fuels that they place in Canada. And again, to that idea of regulatory flexibility, there's 3 major compliance pathways that they can generate credits, and biofuels is only one. So that's why, unlike a renewable fuel standard, it's very easy to do some back of the napkin math and predict, if you will, or at least forecast what, if you increase it X%, there should be this much more, liters of renewable fuel required to meet that. And you can kind of sketch out market share for canola and other feedstocks. Under the clean fuel regulation, it's fairly speculative. I mean, there are some kind of market dynamics that maybe could lend people to do some forecasting with some, I'm not going to say certainty, but there's some, put some goalposts around some forecasting, but only time will tell what the actual pull for renewable fuels is under the CFR, but with best guesses from those who are more educated than I in this field, renewable fuels, including the government's own modeling for the regulatory impact statement, there will be uptake of renewable fuels in Canada beyond what is current under the CFR. What's going to be the top end of that? Unknown. Within the government's own regulatory impact assessment statement, they speculate 10-11% renewable fuels used. Whereas some third-party independent analysis speculates 8 to 9% renewable content, but again, time will tell. Third point there, from a farm perspective, there is a heavy amount of attention within the reg paid to issues of what they refer to as land use and biodiversity and provisions for ag products and forestry in Canada to be used as a feedstock. Corn for ethanol for some of the plants, mostly domiciled in Ontario and Quebec, and this land use and biodiversity, or LUB, these provisions come into effect January 1, 2024, and really the LUB piece and Canadian farmers satisfying that criteria. That was an area that we stepped into the breach, if you will, and really have been working on hard over the years as canola, and also with other agricultural associations across Canada and the value chain, be it on the bulk or the processing side. Because really, at the end of the day, the LUB criteria and declarations upon sale, they're the only points that are actually coming back and touch the farmer and the farm gate. And so this is something that, with the kind of environmental fixation in policy making of the last 6-7 years, this is an area that we really had to work with the government and a variety of departments on to ensure that, at least as this rolled out, it was hands-off as much as a hands-off on the Canadian farmer and the Canadian agricultural supply chain and value chain as possible. And you'll see that there in that next bullet about how the LUB criteria and the LCA models I've alluded to, we spent a lot of time. And again, we've worked, for a long time. It was, we kind of did a lot of this work on our own over the last decades, and as the regulation was really starting to take place and getting down to brass tacks of operation and interaction with the federal departments, again being led by ECCC, but certainly in conversation with Ag Canada and Natural Resources Canada, and really anyone else who would listen, helping to try to shape this so it's the lightest touch for farmers in general across Canada, for the canola industry and canola farmers specifically. And to some degree, we had the most to lose in all this because we are a bulk system, which majority of canola grades Canada 1. We have a bulk system that's not really into heavy segregation like some other commodity products. So really wanting to maintain that kind of the ease of use and not need for segregation and supply chains as this feedstock moves forward. And again, unlike corn, where a farmer might be delivering directly to an ethanol plant, they know it's going into biofuels. In the canola situation, a farmer delivering to a Western Grain Elevator Association member or a Canadian Oilseed Processor Association member does not know that their canola is actually going to end up for what use, be it human consumption, industrial consumption, or feed, or what have you, and where. So trying to make this as easy as possible. So from a farm perspective, you don't even know it's happening in the background. So that's really kind of what we've been working on as CCGA with our partners in the CFR development. So the final thoughts in the CFR, before we kind of pivot off to some more of the market reaction to all this, is that, again, as I said, the regulation has been finalized. There are a couple interpretive and administrative issues for canola and all ag feedstocks that we're still working on even today. They're live, even though the reg, putting up the goalposts for the program, if you will, and the rules of the game are set. There are some interpretative pieces that we're still in dialogue that hopefully we'll have in the coming weeks, if not months, some certainty on. And again, just seeking to have this, the ideas that this operates in the background to the greatest degree possible. And you as a farmer don't even need to worry about this. And hopefully once the finer points on this have been fully ascertained, certainly you'll hear more from CCGA and the value chain on this. Because again, there will be some changes to declarations that will have to, some verbiage in future declarations for your sale of your canola and other commodities to to meet some of the finer points of the reg. And again, just a major takeaway, difficult to ascertain or even project what this might look like with any certainty. But you know, I haven't seen one projection that says it's not going to have an effect and a lift on the uptake of canola and biofuels in general. And again, the rules have been set, and now you see companies and those in the processing chain all the way to the finished the fuel manufacturers starting to see how they can capture market share and investments and programs coming out accordingly. And just from a kind of a farm association perspective with our value chain partners like the Canola Council, CFR, just because it's done, it's not a done deal, if you will. It's going to need ongoing monitoring and maintenance, if you will, to understand what's happening, what's obviously the uptake of the feedstock, but then also there will be some pieces around that life cycle analysis model and other things moving forward that we need to keep a keen eye on and be at that table, raising our voices around. So I just want to, we've talked about Canada. In this space, the 49th parallel is largely invisible, if you will. We have currently unfettered access of agricultural feedstocks, of biofuels, and of fuel products back and forth across the border. And certainly the Canola Council has been working on this issue since 2010, and they redoubled their efforts in the last couple of years. But again, a demand driver coming from a regulatory regime. In December, just before Christmas of 2022, the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, published their final rule and finalized a canola pathway. And really under the Environmental Protection Agency renewable fuel standard in the States, canola has met this threshold to be used as an advanced biofuel, which is a nomenclature they use down there. So it generates a different style of credit under that American system. And this is huge. I mean, I just grabbed a very quick search and grabbed a couple headlines around that from early December of 2022. But this is a major policy win for the Canadian Canola and the American Canola associations and value chains, and certainly for farmers as well on both sides of the border. And you may ask yourself why. This next slide puts this in perspective. So this is just a little over a month old from the United States Energy Information Administration. You put us here in 2022. This is the renewable diesel production capacity existing and what's been planned. So these are actual, this is from, the announcements of various companies, and you can see the increase here in renewable diesel investment in the United States. So again, as we have unfettered access to that market, I think this picture or this graph paints that picture of what that demand looks like in the States, and that ability to have that coveted D5 RIN, or renewable identification number, and that generation of that credit under that American system is a huge win, if you will, for the canola industry in North America, and certainly with the supply we have in Canada and all the other investments we'll talk about here shortly. This is a major driver. So hopefully that kind of provides you that sense of why why the Canola Council and the value chain were excited when the EPA did announce that in December of last year. Turning back to Canada, for those following, obviously, the canola industry, during the time of the pandemic there in 2021, 22, we had a flurry of investments being made in processing investment in Canada, all domiciled in Saskatchewan, with Richardson at Yorkton having an expansion of their existing facility, and Viterra Cargill and the FCL AGT announcement, the latter three around Regina, major, right? And several of the releases from the companies specifically noted biofuel production, again, the stability and the, in some cases, enhancement of these existing and forthcoming regulations and this new regulatory landscape, with the CFR being one of them as drivers of demand. And here is that reaction of the marketplace and these processors to get their market share. And you can see in the box there, really that 50% increase from 2020. And time flies, but the last new build of a canola crush plant in Canada was in 2015. So this was really a signal from the the industry, really stepping up to the plate to, grab the market share and also really kind of find, and try to seek out their opportunities in this new regulatory landscape on both sides of the border. And we also now see these major energy companies starting to partner with grain companies and looking to secure their, as the major energy companies, when I'm talking about the obligated parties here in Canada and the United States, the major refiners looking to partner and get into agreement with the processing companies and to secure their supply for their renewable fuel production designs. And we also see the similar in the States being mirrored in the soybean space as well, with some pretty significant investment. So on the refinery side, so again, those obligated parties, and the last couple of years has been 7 refinery announcements in Canada, 5 in Western Canada, as I note there. And based on the investors toolkit and announcements from the various companies, the chart showing the kind of takeoff, if you will, of renewable diesel capacity in Canada. I will note there's an asterisk beside Parkland. Very recently, about 10 days ago, in their Q4 investors update, Parkland has decided to put a pause on their renewable diesel plant in British Columbia. And they are going to continue on with their co-processing, but a variety of issues, they've decided to put the pause on that. And I do note that the Covenant, Saskatchewan, that would be it's a newer company looking to do their first build. But when you tally it all up, you can see that growth. If we did this presentation a year or two ago, there's no renewable diesel capacity in Canada. There has been some co-processing tested. We do have biodiesel, but renewable diesel, when we talk about a standalone plant or a standalone operation within a existing refinery, we do not have those as of yet. They are coming, and there are, as you see from those 5 companies, I guess now with Parkland being aligned through that, 4 companies still looking at moving on that as we speak. I just want to point out too that not only the regulations setting the kind of demand basis for the renewable fuels, be it the clean fuel regulation, the US EPA's renewable fuel standard, or the provincial or state level renewable fuel standards, but there's also a whole, there's tax issues, state, provincial, and federal. There's, obviously the financial markets and what goes on there. There's the tax policies. There's even when it gets down to the municipal permitting of these projects, which are, still they're industrial of nature. So taking green or brown field and trying to get I'm just saying here, there's a lot that goes into actually, from the announcement of a plant to actually commissioning it and starting up the actual renewable fuel production. It's complex. It takes, you can have your best plans, they're always affected. So timelines are changing, but just really that, again, just keep in mind that there's a lot that goes into actually, announcing a plant to breaking ground to actually having it commissioned and producing fuel, especially on a standalone plant. Every level of government and environmental approval is involved here. It's a complex, pathway to having that liftoff, but certainly, hopefully all these projects have, the wherewithal to withstand those hurdles and get them done. So what does that come down to here? This is kind of just a forecast, a scenario, if you will, kind of what we do currently. And this is in a million metric tons of seed equivalent. So just taking all that kind of oil and turning it into a seed equivalent to give you a sense. Currently maybe just a nick under 2 million tons in any given year goes into biofuels in the markets of Canada, the United States, and the EU. 2025, maybe it's around 4-ish. And by 2030, perhaps 6.5. And again, just wanting to provide an indicative scenario. When you think about production of anywhere, 19, 20, 21 million tons, this gives you kind of a perspective of what if all this came to fruition, what we, by 2030, we could be looking around that, that 6 million, 7 million ton, potentially more, potentially less, seed equivalent going into biofuels. So really just as a summary, we've got the policy drivers and the demand being made by those policy drivers in all jurisdictions in North America are really driving this. And I would say that unlike perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, we do see now policy stability. You see that in, governments and international commitments to, GHG reductions, et cetera. Maybe a new government will come in a particular jurisdiction and might tweak some of the regulations, but in general, we don't see in North America the rolling back of these regulations. So there was a degree of policy stability that then the industry, be it on the crush side or the manufacturers of fuels, do see some policy stability to make some long-term investments. And again, this is driving investment in processing and production capacity, as we've just talked about. Again, we do see a value-added processing benefits farmers, the value chain, and the Canadian economy. And one thing to think about on the other side of this is regardless of if much of this new production capacity and for processing in canola, regardless of how much of that ends up going into the biofuels market as an end market. Certainly the fact that we're going to be changing the profile of less seed being exported raw and more oil going to for use continentally or offshore, it's going to have an effect on the transportation system in Canada. And certainly we all keep our eyes on the bulk and processed, the profile of it, the issues that arise in getting those products to the end market. And that's good. That distribution profile is going to change as we double that capacity in Western Canada. Be less perhaps bulk seed traveling in hoppers to dominantly West Coast ports, Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and we might now have more private oil cars and meal cars moving both the liquid and the bulk meal to again perhaps offshore, but then also continentally as well as those markets mature. And really, again, we look at this from a farm perspective, from a value chain perspective. There's that need at least sustain, if not grow, our canola seed supply, and improving the productivity and our production around this is important to satisfy not only this growing demand, but ideally, when we look at our strategic plans for the sector, trying to meet new and existing sources of demand. And really, when we think about the fuel side and this industrial use as a sliver and maybe a growing sliver of our pie, if you will, we really see it. And when we think about it and do some of the calcs, a sustainable supply should be able to meet easily both food and fuel demand for the foreseeable future. And again, ideally, we have growing productive supply, but certainly, we should, as we looked at that kind of indicative demand scenario, there should be enough to go around for everybody and all uses moving forward. So my last minute or two here, I just want to point out, it's not just us within the ag sector and on the biofuels subsector specifically. I just wanted to highlight two corporate kind of releases of late. All these major corporations have their environmental footprint reduction as top of mind as boards and as companies. For a variety of reasons. And here you see just CN came out with a specific release earlier this year around not only looking to support the growth of renewable fuel industry as they look to transport those products and grab that market share for distribution around North America, but then also in the bottom box using it as well and looking at renewable diesel and higher blend biodiesels and testing that. And this picture was actually from their news release, and I just thought that was interesting that there's your kind of typical blooming canola field beside a CN locomotive. And so again, looking that virtual cycle, if you will, of Western Canadian farmers producing the canola and both of our railways transporting it and ideally using it in the engines that transport that crop as well, is a nice kind of conceptual picture and also a good visual as well. And lastly, I just want to point out, and this is another kind of wind in the sail. We did talk about Parkland backing away from their facility. Imperial Oil came out, they announced this a couple of years ago, but then late in January 2023, I think we all know what that means, right on time. But Imperial Oil in Strathcona announcing their $720 million facility, the renewable diesel facility, to be kind of housed within their existing refinery complex, looking to produce 20,000 barrels a day of renewable diesel. Big announcement, big investment, and again moving things in the right direction, and just a real kind of as we crossed into 2023, another good news story on this whole opportunity, and seeing some big investment from big traditional players who now are getting into this space as well. So Roger, that is it from my end, and I'll turn it back to you.
Right. Thanks, Steve. That was a very informative presentation, and I know you've been working on this file for several years now, and as a result of that have really made many improvements for farmers as a result of all your hard work. And I think that's something that we need to really pay attention to and give you a big thanks for. I truly do believe this is an exciting development for canola farmers, and I'm going to be looking forward to seeing what the future of our industry is once biofuels are fully being utilized. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the session. I'm going to remind you again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. We've already got a few that have started to come in, and I'm going to read them off. And Steve, I'll get you to answer them, because I think you're the most qualified to answer most of these questions. The first one is a question, and I know that we've been facing quite often in this industry in light of all of the announcements that have occurred. And the question is, in light of the present crisis in the world food stocks, how can we continue to use edible food products as a feedstock? You want to answer that, Steve?
Sure. Yeah, I guess just in general terms, I mean, we look at our, again, we've always promoted modest industrial use as kind of a policy, to kind of, at single digit kind of percentages, if you will. We're not advocating for anything that would, start consuming, into the 10, 20, 30% of the crop. So it's still, it's under 10%. Also, when you look at canola, unlike some of the other ag commodities, it's an oil. It's not like it's a corn or other a wheat. So I mean, it's got its roots in historically industrial uses, and here this is just the most modern kind of manifestation of that. So certainly, though, it is tied to productivity. As long as we keep Canadian productivity in the ag space in general, at least from our lens on this, again, getting back to that refrain of, I think there's enough for food and fuel. And again, we've always been looking at this from a modest sliver of our overall end use. But at the end of the day, if this is where the market's going, though, the market will kind of dictate things. So it's not us setting the policy, it's the government of Canada and other jurisdictions, and capturing some market share to the benefit of Canadian farmers who we represent. The government in creating these policies is aware of that issue, but they're modeling, others modeling, and again, specifically in the canola space, in the canola world, that's yeah, look, it's out there as an issue, but it's not something I think that we're going to necessarily butt up against anytime soon as far as our profile.
Great, thanks, Steve. A second question we have here is, on the canola seed demand scenario slide, shows seed demand for Canada, US combined. Any idea seed demand just for Canadian renewable diesel plants versus the total?
Yeah, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I just don't have that at the front of mind. But certainly, many of the renewable diesel plants have talked about canola specifically, and hence why they're kind of they're new ones. The new ones in Alberta, potentially in Saskatchewan, and then certainly the ones out in BC are using canola. So that is a good question. I don't have that off the top of my head, but certainly it will be significant. And they either mention canola by name as a feedstock and or allude to it. But again, I think that's why you see not only on the renewable diesel side of things, but that's again why those crush investments are happening in Saskatchewan as well. and who knows if there will be other announcements forthcoming, but to be able to feed those plants and be at least in reasonable proximity. But short answer is I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm just going to remind everybody again, if you do have any more questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There are several more here, Steve. I'll ask you this one here quickly. You note that the government policies are driving the growth in biofuel demand. What happens if the policies are overturned? How large a risk is that?
Yeah, I mean, that is always that is a risk. I mean, I think I kind of just mentioned that is a policy risk, but I would think where we stand today, again, I made a quick comment there in my presentation about we might see, like let's say federally in Canada, if a new government or when a new government comes in, a new government of a certain stripe might take it further on the kind of sustainability side of things and GHG reductions, and another government might keep the same framework and tone it back a little bit, maybe make it a little more easy to comply with or a little more streamlined. So I think, as we look at recent history, I don't know if we're going to, at least in North America, voters, governments, regardless of political stripe and persuasion, I don't think the risk is fairly, well, it's always there, but I would say that many of these policies have become somewhat entrenched as a concept. And again, if you are looking to decarbonize transportation here and now in a quantifiable way, this is basically, this is your way to do it. That doesn't necessarily need direct subsidies, long runways. You set the policy and the market will respond, as we're seeing now. So policy risk is always there, but in the foreseeable future, I don't see them being outright repealed. They could be diluted somewhat, but that's the beauty of where we sit in canola as well. Those canola processing plants, the end use of that product can be for industrial, can be for human, can be, we can tailor the product and the oil coming out of that. So we're not throwing all our the fortunes of the industry all in one basket.
Great, thanks, Steve. Here's the next question. It actually is a two-part question. It starts off several questions. One, will the food quality of canola oil demand be affected? Two, those who are really concerned with climate change do not promote fossil fuels use. And in Canada, fertilizer use is also questioned. How does this all come together under this?
Sure. So it really kind of on the first one about the food quality, the crush plants can be, my understanding is that they can be calibrated, the majority of them, so you can have a food grade, degummed, deodorized canola oil that comes out, but you can also just recalibrate the internal machinery and have more of a crude oil that comes out. So the renewable diesel plant will, when they enter into agreements with the canola crush plant or that company, they'll have their specifications. So it can be a lower grade, less refined spec that the diesel fuel needs, but at the same time, that same plant can change up the line slightly and get back to food grade. So that's what I kind of alluded to in my last answer, was that it's not it's not 100% proposition that we're only doing this or that. It can be either or. And again, to that climate change issues and fossil fuel promotion, I mean, we all know that environmental NGOs and some segment of our population has this idea that we can just completely change the world and our economy and our use of energy on a dime. Not going to happen. I would just submit that here again, to one of my first points, is a way that ag industry in Canada, the canola industry in Canada, can help decarbonize. If decarbonization is this goal, regardless of the mode of fuel or the energy that's transporting people, goods, what have you, here's a way that we can make quantifiable contributions to carbon emissions reduction today and tomorrow and for the foreseeable future, until such time that we completely divest ourselves of fossil fuels as a society, if and when we actually get to that point. So again, I look at it less as maybe taking that kind of perspective and saying, here's a quantifiable way to get along that road. And again, it's not a either or proposition. It's here's something we can do to help contribute to whatever the government in power puts out there as that kind of target or that regulatory requirement. We can be part of that solution.
Okay, again, thanks, Steve. We've got two questions that are really connected or touch on the same thing. So I think if you answer the one, it'll answer both. Steve, can you touch on sustainable aviation fuel? I think most companies are focused on renewable fuels for trucks, tractors, trains, etc. Companies like Covenant are largely focused on SAF. Is there something to this, and can you provide a bit more feedback or background?
Yep. So sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, if you will, that's the kind of newest incarnation or use as a renewable fuel. So, if you think about that kind of spectrum, we started with biodiesel, and then we moved to renewable diesel and co-processing, and SAF is right there. So it's basically the same principle as renewable diesel. You're just making a spec of finished fuel that meets the standards, the engineering standards, the chemical engineering standards to be used in aviation and in airplanes and aircraft. So that's going on. There's testing going on right now in North America using co-processed canola in sustainable aviation fuel. I mean, it's just, so short answer is it's there. Canola can be used for it. It's just a different kind of variation on basically what's called a renewable diesel, again, to that spec. It's being tested, but that one I would just say is the next kind of frontier, if you will, of a market, and certainly that's a thirsty market. But the one thing about sustainable aviation fuel, unless you're doing that as a company specific, that is a multi-jurisdictional and interjurisdictional world. So it's a little different kind of from a regulatory perspective on mandating or incenting that use. It's going to have to that one's a bit more of a different, more difficult policy kind of environment, just because that these planes are leaving and fueling up in various places and jurisdictions around the world. But all that to say is it's here in its infancy. Canola certainly can be used for it, and again, that it would, if that at some point, a generation or a decade from now, that really takes off, that will be a monster market.
Okay, great, Steve. We've got a question here that may take a little bit of research. Can you speak to Richard Gray's comments about carbon accounting? And the person here references an article, I think, in the Western Producer. So I think it'd be fair for you to answer that one at a different time, Steve. I do think it's important to me that you do look at that, and maybe we'll try and get that information on our website later on. There are still several more questions I think we can go through. I'll read them off quickly here. Thank you for Steve and Roger regarding LUB. Do you foresee the additional data metrics may be required for the grower in the future, as the processors, producers have a valid carbon intensity, i.e. nitrogen use, BMPs?
Yeah, so I can answer that one in real short amount of time. The LUB criteria, that is the vision of the federal government, that you can do that, but that is still going to be years down the road. I mean, they're still really they just got this initial model off the ground, and they've already had to push out some of the most kind of fundamental pieces that go into the and adjudicating issues around like soil organic carbon. So that is something that is kind of the vision, to have customizable rather carbon intensities for a region of growers or something, but that is still going to be years off, although that is the kind of vision of Environment and Climate Change Canada. But there's a lot that goes into that. So they need to, if you will, they need to learn to walk before they can run.
Okay, the next one here is really a little bit of a building on it. You might have answered it already. Do Canadian canola growers meet the land use and biodiversity provisions now, or will we have to make farming practices to meet them going forward?
Yeah, as it stands today, our understanding is that Canadian agriculture will meet the LUB criteria and operates in the background. The only thing is that as I alluded to, we're still working on some of the actual administrative aspects of that before it becomes public. We're still in some conversations with the regulators. So, but in general terms, Canadian ag is sustainable. We spent 3 years trying to ensure that we're recognized by our own government as being sustainable and able to pass the bar, if you will, on the LUB criteria.
This is a really good question. And I know this one has been an issue with some of our importers. And the question is, what are countries who depend on our food quality canola saying about this development?
Yeah, I mean, they're aware of it. They look at, what I just showed you, they can all see the same thing, be it domestically or continentally or internationally. And to that question, there will be, who knows the degree to which it'll happen, but there will be a shifting of the marketplace and of pricing. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I would just say that there will be market dynamics and market changes that may end up, again, shifting our kind of traditional profile of where we send products, be it seed, oil, or meal. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of too early to tell what that's going to look like and the degree to which that's going to look like, but I don't think we should be surprised if and when that happens.
One more question in the Q&A, and then like I said, I don't want to discourage people if they have more questions. There is opportunity after this presentation to send us more questions for us to answer them. But the last question is, doesn't growing crops for biofuel contradict the carbon sequestration scenario for tackling climate change? We would be utilizing the carbon stocks to grow the crops and ending up emitting them to the atmosphere eventually.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, just in short, I mean, again, this is, I mean, I guess, you know, even in science and whatnot, there's several camps on particular issues. And I mean, the government of Canada has got their model and all their scientists. This isn't us as CCGA talking about this and saying this. This is, you know, the United States EPA. This is the government of Canada and the provincial model that the other provinces use. This is all based in, you know, quantifiable science and what have you, and a body of literature. And, you know, we just look to fit ourselves into that rubric and maximize what we can do. And again, I'm not really answering the question, but I don't have kind of any thoughts on that. That's not really my area of expertise.
Hey, Steve. The number of questions we had is great. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to write them. And obviously this topic is got a lot of interest, Steve. So this, in the interest of time, we're already a couple minutes over our scheduled time. This concludes today's webinar. Please make sure you register for our next one on March 16th about our advocacy efforts in Ottawa with Dave Carey, CCGA's Vice President, Government and Industry Relations, and use the link in the chat to register for that. The webinar is at 12 p.m. Manitoba time or 10 a.m. Alberta time. If you missed the first webinar in our series, you can watch recording on the CCGA website. And this particular session will be recorded when we post it on ccga.ca next week, following CCGA's social channels to get notified when the recording is up. So again, I just want to take a minute to say thanks to everyone who took the time to join us today. If you do have any further questions about today's presentations, you can always email us at communications@ccga.ca. As well, the provincial canola growers groups are always open to hearing farmers' feedback on a provincial level and how we can best represent you on your policy issues. So if you have any more comments in general or in nature, I would encourage you to contact either the CCGA or the provincial associations. So thanks to everyone. Again, I really appreciate Steve and our group in CCGA for taking the time to put this all together and making this go off flawlessly. And do appreciate everyone that came out to listen to Steve's presentation and the fantastic questions that we had. So thank you, and look forward to seeing everybody on the 16th. Thanks very much.